Under the burning sun of the Arizona frontier, the wind carried the smell of dust, whiskey, and regret. It was the kind of place where mercy had no name, and a man's worth was weighed in bullets or gold. The town had no law, but the trembling fear that followed the cruel men who ruled it. Among them were 3 drifters men, hardened by greed and sin, whose laughter often echoed down the dry streets like a warning. On one desperate evening, when the saloon lamps flickered low and the whiskey had run dry, they made a trade that would change their fates forever. For the price of a single bottle of wine, they sold a woman when they had no right to own, no heart to pity, no soul to understand. She had once been a healer, gentle as rain after drought. Her hair fell dark against her shoulders, and her eyes, though tired, carried the quiet fire of someone who had endured too much. The men had taken her from a camp near the old river bend, where she had been searching for her brother who never returned from the white man's town. They had promised to help, and she, too trusting for her own good, had followed. Now she sat in the dirt behind the saloon, wrists bound, the laughter of her captors drowning the last of her hope. They called her Indian, as though that word stripped her of her humanity, and they drank to their own cruelty, while she prayed to spirits that perhaps no longer listened. The trade was quick, a travel-atoll, unshaven. His hat pulled low slid a bottle across the table and dragged her away by the arm as though she were no more than a shadow. The onlookers pretended not to see. In this town, conscience was a luxury few could afford. When the night fell, the woman's cry was carried off by the wind, swallowed by the endless stretch of desert that surrounded the town like a curse. But far beyond those dry hills, Figure rode under the pale moonlight. His horse moved swift and silent, hooves sinking into the soft sand. His name was whispered among soldiers and settlers alike. The Apache warrior whose vengeance struck like a storm from nowhere. Some said he fought for his people. Others said he fought for ghosts. But tonight, he rode for something deeper. The woman taken was not a stranger to him. Once, before the bloodshed and betrayals, before the white man's greed burned their villages and scattered their kin, she had been part of his life. They had shared a promise in the hush of twilight, before the world turned cruel. Now, word had reached him that she had been sold by those same men who once hunted his kind for sport. He moved through the desert like a shadow that the stars themselves feared to touch. The trail was fresh, the scent of horses, the faint prints of wagon wheels leading toward the settlement by the trading post. He stopped at a ridge overlooking the town, his bow resting across his back. Below, lamplight flickered through the open windows of the saloon, laughter rising with the music of a broken piano. He could almost taste the whiskey-soaked arrogance in the air. His jaw tightened. He had seen men like these before, men who thought they owned the earth and everything upon it, men who believed cruelty was a right, not a sin. Inside the saloon, the cruel ones were celebrating their night's bargain. The bottle they traded her for was nearly empty now, its contents spilled across the table, dripping down like the blood on their conscience. One of them leaned back in his chair, smirking, while the other 2 argued over who would take her next when they tired of their fun. They didn't notice the door swing open, didn't see the wind shift, didn't feel the change in the air until the music stopped and silence claimed the room. Every man turned toward the doorway where he stood tall, stark and still as stone, eyes fixed on the 3 who had brought shame upon his people. No one spoke. Even the oil lamp seemed to flicker in fear. The bartender swallowed hard and stepped back, knowing something ancient had entered a reckoning wrapped in flesh and fury. The Apache warrior's gaze swept across the room, then settled on the woman. She sat slumped against the wall, her wrists still bound, her face streaked with dirt and tears. But when she saw him, her breath caught. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw not death, but deliverance. One of the men rose, trying to sound brave. "You got business here, Injun?" he said, spitting the word like poison. The warrior didn't answer. His hand moved with quiet grace, pulling the bow from his back, string drawn before the man even realized he was marked. The arrow pointed at his chest, steady as his heartbeat. The others froze, too drunk to run, too afraid to move. The warrior's voice was low, rough from years of silence. "You sold her," he said. "Now you will beg." The man laughed nervously, but his voice cracked. "We were just having a bit of fun. Ain't no harm done." The warrior's expression didn't change. His bow tightened, the string singing softly like a warning. The room held its breath. Even the wind outside seemed to wait. The woman closed her eyes, trembling not from fear of him, but from the weight of what was about to happen. For once, justice had come riding on horseback through the desert, wearing no badge, speaking no law, only truth. The older of the three men dropped to his knees first, mumbling something that might have been a prayer. The second followed, his hands shaking as he reached for his pistol,
Only yes.
to find the warrior's arrow aimed directly between his eyes. "No more lies," the warrior said. "No more taking what is not yours." His words carried more power than any bullet. The third man, the one who had dragged the woman away, tried to crawl backward, his voice breaking as he pleaded. "We didn't mean nothing by it, I swear. Just let us go." But the Apache didn't move. The bow remained steady, his eyes locked on the trembling man before him. The silence grew heavier with every heartbeat. Behind him, the woman whispered his name, soft sound that brought the memory of who he once was before the wars, before the burning of his village, before vengeance became his only companion. He turned slightly, meeting her gaze, and something inside him shifted. She was still alive. That was enough for now. The sheriff's voice suddenly echoed from outside. He's calling for calm, his boots crunching across the dirt. "What's going on in there?" he shouted. The Apache's eyes narrowed. He knew the sound of authority that cared only for order, not justice. The men before him started to beg louder, hoping the sheriff's arrival meant salvation. The woman looked between them all, her heart torn between fear and faith. The warrior knew that once he loosed his arrow, there would be no turning back. The law would hunt him again. It's the same law that had never hunted men like these for their crimes. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping dust across the porch, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. Somewhere deep in the desert, the storm was coming. Inside the saloon, 3 guilty men trembled under the aim of an Apache bow. A woman's breath trembled in the air, and time itself seemed to stop. And then he lowered the bow. Only slightly, eyes never leaving theirs. "You will beg," he repeated, voice steady as stone. "But not to me." His words struck harder than any weapon. The sheriff's shadow crossed the doorway, his hand resting on his holster. Unaware of the reckoning, waiting inside, the Apache turned his gaze toward the woman, and for a moment their eyes held 1,000 unspoken stories lost, love, and the fire of survival. But before anyone could speak again, the door creaked wider, boots stepped closer, and the world braced for what would come next. The town, once silent, seemed to hold its breath, knowing that when the first sound broke the air, nothing would ever be the same again. The sheriff stood at the doorway, his hat shadowing his eyes as he tried to make sense of the scene before him. 3 men on their knees, one trembling, one sweating, and one still too drunk to understand how close he was to meeting his end. The Apache warrior stood motionless, bow drawn halfway, his stance calm but deadly. The woman sat quietly near the wall, her face half hidden by her hair, watching everything with a mix of fear and something deeper trust. Maybe, though she herself wasn't sure anymore. The sheriff's voice was careful when he spoke. "Put that weapon down, son," he said, his tone carrying the weight of authority, but not of courage. "Ain't no good can come of spilling blood in this town tonight." The warrior didn't answer. His silence was heavier than words. Every soul in that room could feel the storm that waited just behind his eyes. The sheriff took a cautious step forward, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. But the look he received in return made him stop cold. The Apache's gaze was sharp, like the edge of a blade honed by years of sorrow and revenge. The sheriff had seen killers before, but this man was different. There was no hate in his face, only purpose, and that scared him more than rage ever could. The woman slowly lifted her head, her voice trembling as she spoke for the first time. "Please," she said softly, her words breaking through the tension like a whisper carried on the wind. "No more blood. Not for me." The Apache turned his head slightly toward her, the bow still drawn, his breathing steady. Her eyes searched his as if trying to remind him of something lost in the years between them, something pure that hadn't been crushed by pain and betrayal. For a moment, it worked. His hands lowered the bow an inch. That inch was all the sheriff needed. He moved fast, drawing his revolver, but before the barrel could rise, the Apache fired. The arrow sliced the air, striking the gun clean from the sheriff's hand and burying it into the wooden post beside him. The room erupted in chaos. Men dove for cover, glasses shattered, and the saloon filled with shouting. The Apache didn't move from where he stood, his bow steady again, another arrow already knocked. The sheriff froze, hand bleeding from the splintered wood. "Enough," the warrior said, his voice low but steady. "I came for what was taken. Nothing more." Outside, the sound of thunder rolled closer. The townsfolk, drawn by the noise, gathered at the windows and doors, whispering in fear. Stories about the Apache had traveled far, stories of the man who struck down a cavalry patrol single-handedly, who vanished into the desert like smoke, who carried the spirits of his ancestors in every arrow he loosed. Some said he was not entirely human. Looking at him now, standing tall and unflinching amid trembling men, it was easy to believe those stories were true. The sheriff hesitated, then raised his uninjured hand, signaling for calm. "You're outnumbered, friend," he said. "You don't want to start a war here." "I didn't start it," the Apache answered quietly. "Your men did when they took her." His voice carried across the room, reaching the ears of those who pretended not to know the truth. A murmur spread through the crowd outside. They all knew what kind of men the three traitors were. They'd seen their cruelty before, but had chosen silence. Now that silence turned heavy, like a weight pressing down on everyone watching. The woman's eyes glistened as she turned toward the sheriff. "He speaks the truth," she said. "They took me. They sold me like I was worth less than the dirt under their boots." The sheriff looked at her, guilt flickering in his eyes. He had heard rumors of such things happening in the border towns, but had always turned his head the other way. There were no laws strong enough to protect a native woman, and no court willing to hear her voice. But now, standing before her, he could no longer pretend the law was anything more than a word carved into dust. The Apache motioned toward the woman. "She comes with me," he said firmly, "and they stay to answer for what they've done." The men on the floor began to whimper again, their arrogance gone, their faces pale with fear. The sheriff swallowed hard. He knew if he said no, more blood would spill before the night was over. And deep down, he knew who deserved it. He looked toward the trembling men, then back at the warrior. "Take her," he said finally. "But do it quick, before others come. You won't be safe here." The Apache nodded once, lowering his bow. He stepped toward the woman and cut her bindings with a single motion. She winced as the rope fell from her wrists, rubbing her sore skin, her breath shaky with disbelief. For a moment, she looked up at him, trying to find words. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why come for me after all these years?" He didn't answer, but his eyes said more than words ever could. They spoke of a promise made long ago, of a bond forged in fire and shattered by time as they moved toward the door. The oldest of the men on the floor found his voice. "You'll hang for this, savage," he spat. "The army'll hunt you down like they did your people." The Apache turned slowly, his face unreadable. "They already did," he said, and stepped out into the rain. The woman followed close behind him. The sheriff stood frozen, torn between duty and conscience. The men still knelt on the saloon floor, shivering as thunder shook the sky. Outside, the wind had picked up, sweeping dust and rain through the narrow streets. The people who had gathered stepped back as the Apache and the woman passed, their eyes filled with fear and awe. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers. None dared to stop him. They walked toward the stables where his horse waited. The animal restless under the storm's approach. The woman stumbled once, weak from hunger and exhaustion, but he caught her arm gently, helping her up. She looked at him, her voice faint. "You shouldn't have come. They'll never stop now." He met her gaze, his expression steady. "Then let them come." Lightning cracked across the horizon, lighting the desert in a pale glow. For a moment, she saw the scars across his arms and chest, faint reminders of battles long past. He had lost much: family, friends, his home. Yet there was still something unbroken in him, something fierce that even time couldn't destroy. She realized then that his vengeance wasn't born only of anger. It came from love too, love twisted by pain, but love all the same. They rode out of town just as the rain began to fall, the storm chasing them into the open plains. Behind them, the sheriff watched from the saloon steps. The bottle still lying on the table inside, half empty and glinting in the flickering light. He knew this night would haunt the town for years. He also knew the Apache wasn't finished. Men like that didn't disappear quietly as the horse galloped through the desert. The woman clung to him, her thoughts racing between past and present. She remembered the days before war came, before their people were scattered and hunted. He had been a protector even then, the one who stood between danger and those too gentle to fight. She had loved him once, but life had torn them apart. Now, fate had brought them together again. But under the shadow of violence, the rain turned the sand into mud. The wind howled through the canyon as they sought shelter beneath a rocky ridge. He built a small fire, the flames flickering against the stone walls. She sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket he had carried, her eyes fixed on the fire. "They'll follow," she said quietly. "The sheriff won't be able to hold them back for long." He didn't look up. "I know." His voice was calm, but beneath it was something she recognized, a quiet sadness that came from living too long with ghosts. For a long time, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, and the fire crackled softly between them. Finally she asked, "What happens now?" He lifted his gaze, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Now," he said, "they will learn what it means to beg for forgiveness." His words carried no anger, only truth. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of his promise. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, echoing across the open desert. And back in the town, the sheriff gathered the frightened men, his face pale as lightning flashed through the broken windows. "You brought this on yourselves," he muttered, "and now you'd better pray he doesn't come back." But deep down, he knew the Apache would return. And when he did, it wouldn't be mercy he carried, it would be justice, carved from the desert itself, as unforgiving as the land that had made him. The rain slowed by morning, leaving the desert washed clean but heavy with the scent of wet earth and smoke. The Apache warrior stirred the dying embers of their small fire, his eyes fixed on the faint line of dawn breaking across the horizon. The woman slept nearby, her head resting against her arm, exhaustion still written across her face. For a moment, watching her breathe, he remembered a different time before everything turned to blood and silence. Back then, her laughter had carried through the canyons, and her hands had healed the wounded, no matter who they were. That memory was the only part of his past he hadn't buried. Now, it was also the reason he couldn't stop. He rose to his feet and scanned the land around them. The air was still too quiet for comfort. He knew the men from town wouldn't rest easy. The sheriff might have wanted peace, but the ones humiliated in that saloon wouldn't forgive being made to kneel in front of their own people. They would come, maybe by nightfall, maybe sooner. He had seen the type before, men who thought killing an Apache would make them heroes. They'd gather others with the promise of gold or pride and ride out with rifles and torches, thinking the desert would hide their sins. He was ready for that. He had lived too long in the wild not to be. The woman stirred, her voice soft and weak. "You didn't sleep," she said. He shook his head. "I don't sleep when danger follows." She sat up slowly, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes met his. "You should have left me there," she whispered. "You've only brought their anger on yourself." He looked at her, calm and steady. Their anger was already mine to carry. The words hung between them, heavy with a truth neither could deny. Far away, back in town, the sheriff's office was crowded. The three men who had been spared sat across from him, nursing bruises and drinking coffee with shaking hands. The oldest one slammed his cup down. "We can't just let him ride off like that," he said, his voice hard but trembling underneath. "He made us beg like dogs." Sheriff leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Maybe that's what you deserved," he muttered, though not loud enough for them to hear. The town had always looked the other way when those men crossed the line, but now their sins had come home to roost. He knew sending a posse after the Apache meant more blood, but letting things lie would make him look weak. The people wanted justice, and they wanted it loud. One of the younger men spat on the floor. "You find him, Sheriff, and we end this. He ain't human, the way he moves. He'll come back for us. I can feel it." The sheriff sighed and stood. "He will," he said quietly. "And that's what scares me." He walked to the window, watching the dust settle on the empty street. He had fought in the wars against the tribes years ago. He'd seen men like that Apache before, soldiers who'd turned their grief into strength. They couldn't be hunted, only provoked. And when provoked, they brought hell with them. The woman and the warrior traveled deeper into the canyons as the sun climbed high. The land was harsh but familiar to him. He knew which streams still ran, which caves offered shelter, and which ridges could keep a man hidden from rifles. They stopped near a small creek where wild sage grew thick. She knelt beside the water, washing her face, her reflection rippling with the current. "Do you ever wish it all could go back?" she asked suddenly. "Before the war, before the killing?" He didn't answer right away. "Doesn't go back," he said finally. "Only moves forward, and we walk through the ashes of what we left behind." She looked at him, her eyes full of quiet sadness. "You speak like a man who has already died." He turned his gaze toward the mountains. "Maybe I did," he said, "the day they burned our village." She lowered her head, her throat tightening. She remembered that night, the fire, the screams, the sound of horses as soldiers rode through the camp. He had lost everything, and yet somehow he still lived. Perhaps that was his curse. As the afternoon faded, the sound of distant hoofbeats reached them. He raised his head sharply, listening. She froze, fear flashing in her eyes. He motioned for silence, his hand reaching for his bow. The riders were still far, but there were many to many. He led her away from the open ground, guiding her through a narrow cut in the rocks. They climbed higher, moving quickly, until they reached a ledge that overlooked the trail below. Dust rose from the ground as the posse rode through, rifles glinting in the sunlight. The sheriff rode in front, his face grim. Behind him, the three traders followed, their expressions twisted with hate. The woman gripped his arm. "But you can't fight them all," she whispered. He shook his head. "I don't plan to. Not yet." His eyes followed the riders as they passed beneath them, unaware of the silent watchers above. Once the dust settled and the echoes faded, he turned to her. "We'll move north tonight," he said. "There's a place they won't find us." She nodded, though her heart pounded with dread. She knew what would happen if they did find them. There would be no mercy on either side. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, they made camp again in the shelter of the cliffs. The air was cool and still. She sat close to the fire, staring at the flames. "What will you do if they catch up?" she asked quietly. He didn't look at her. "They'll have to catch me first." His voice was calm, but she could see the shadow in his eyes. He wasn't just protecting her. He was carrying something heavier. Promise, perhaps, or a debt that could never be repaid. Back in town, the sheriff's doubts grew. The men he rode with were too eager for blood, too blind to the danger. They thought this was a hunt, but he knew it was a trap, waiting to be sprung. Every mile they rode took them deeper into the Apache's world, where the rocks themselves could hide an enemy. He'd seen scouts vanish in terrain like this, never to be found again. Still, he couldn't turn back. The town expected him to bring justice. Even if justice had lost its meaning long ago, they made camp near an old abandoned mine, where the wind whistled through the tunnels like whispers of the dead. The youngest of the three traders sat close to the fire, his nerves fraying. "You ever wonder why that woman meant so much to him?" he asked. "Maybe she's one of them. Maybe she helped him once." The oldest man grunted. "Doesn't matter. She's his now. When we find them, we'll take her back and finish what we started." The sheriff glared at him. "Won't touch her," he said coldly. "You'll leave this to me." His voice carried the weight of command, but inside, he knew he might not have the strength to stop them when the time came. The next morning, they rode again, following faint tracks through the sand. The sheriff studied the ground carefully. "He's leading us," he muttered, He wants us to follow." The others laughed it off, but unease crept into their hearts. The trail wound through narrow passes and dry riverbeds until it vanished among the rocks. They dismounted, spreading out to search. The desert was silent, except for the wind and the cry of a hawk circling high above. And then, a single arrow struck the ground between them. They froze. Another arrow followed, this one grazing the sleeve of one man's coat. Panic rippled through the group. Sheriff shouted for calm, but it was too late. The men fired blindly into the rocks, the sound echoing through the canyon. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing, no movement, no sign of the Apache. Only silence. The sheriff's heart pounded. He knew what that meant. The warrior wasn't running. He was watching high above them, hidden behind the ridge. The Apache lowered his bow. He could have ended it, but he didn't, not yet. He turned to the woman beside him. "They know fear now," he said softly. "But fear is only the beginning." She looked at him, her heart heavy. How many more must die before it ends? He didn't answer. The fire in his eyes told her that the war inside him hadn't ended when he left his people's land. It still burned, fed by every injustice he'd seen, every life stolen for greed or pride, as the sun set behind the distant hills. She realized that what bound them together wasn't just survival, it was the weight of a world that refused to change. And somewhere below, the sheriff stared into the fading light. His conscience caught between the law he served and the justice he knew the Apache carried in his heart. The desert had no mercy for either of them, and the night ahead promised only more reckoning. The desert night was darker than usual, and even the stars seemed to hold their breath. The Apache warrior sat by a faint fire deep within the canyon, sharpening the edge of his knife in silence. Across from him, the woman sat wrapped in her blanket, her eyes following the flicker of the flame as if trying to read what it meant for them both. She could sense it, the calm before something terrible. Every sound in the distance made her heart tighten. She knew the men hunting them wouldn't stop now. Shame and vengeance were stronger than whiskey, and the kind of pride those men carried didn't fade with time. He didn't speak much, but she could see the war inside him. The Apache's face was still, his expression unreadable, but his hands moved with purpose, steady and certain. He had been trained for this kind of waiting, the kind that made other men restless and afraid. Yet, beneath the stillness, there was something burning behind his eyes, a question he hadn't yet dared to ask. One tied to her and the choices they had both made long ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Could have left me." "You should have. They'll kill you for what you did back there." Stopped sharpening the blade and looked at her through the firelight. "They were already killing me," he said quietly. "Just slower." His words cut through the silence like the knife in his hand. She turned her gaze away, unable to answer. Somewhere in the distance, the cry of a coyote echoed across the hills. The Apache's head lifted slightly, listening. His instincts told him what his eyes could not see. The hunters were closing in. The wind carried their scent, faint but real. Rose slowly, checking his bow and arrows, his movements deliberate. "They're near," he said. The woman's breath caught. How near? Looked toward the ridge, close enough to smell the fire. They stamped out the flames and packed what little they had. The moon had barely risen, casting only a pale glow over the rocks. The woman followed as he led her up a narrow path that wound through jagged stone. The air was thin and cold, every footstep echoing softly against the canyon walls. Below them, faint lights flickered in the distance, the posse's torches moving like restless spirits through the desert. Back in the sheriff's group, the men were arguing again. The oldest traitor, his pride still bleeding from humiliation, demanded they press on through the night. "He's just one man," he growled. "You all saw him. He ain't no ghost." But the sheriff shook his head. "You don't know these lands like he does. Could be behind any rock watching us right now." The younger one snorted. "Then let him watch. I want him to see what happens when he messes with white men." The sheriff turned his eyes toward the fire, his voice low. "He already has. That's why your friend's hand still shakes." The man looked down, his bravado fading. The truth was, they were afraid. By morning, the sun rose red and heavy over the desert. The Apache and the woman had found shelter in a hidden hollow at the base of a cliff. From there, They could see the dust trail far behind the posse moving slow but steady. The woman knelt beside the small stream that trickled through the rocks. "They won't stop," she said. "You know that." He nodded, staring out across the plains. "I don't want them to." Looked at him, confusion and fear mingling in her eyes. "You mean to fight them all?" He didn't answer, but his silence told her everything. The day stretched long, and the air grew thick with heat. As the woman rested, he climbed higher up the ridge to scout the terrain. From above, he could see their pursuers inching closer, riders moving in a line, rifles slung across their backs. He counted at least 7 now. Reinforcements from town, no doubt. He studied their path carefully, noting where the land dipped, where the rocks narrowed into choke points. He wasn't running anymore. He was preparing when he returned. She was awake, waiting. "You're planning something," she said. He didn't deny it. They chose this path. "I'll end it on mine," her eyes filled with worry. "And if you die?" He looked at her then, his face calm, but his voice carrying weight. "Then I die with peace. But they'll never take you again." She wanted to argue, to beg him to flee with her deeper into the wild where no one could find them. But she knew his kind of resolve. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper, a need to right what had been wronged, to bring balance where there had been cruelty. She lowered her head, knowing she couldn't change him. The storm he carried had been building for years. It wasn't going to break quietly by dusk. The posse reached the mouth of the canyon. The sheriff halted his horse and studied the rocks. "This is bad ground," he said. "We shouldn't go in blind." But the trader beside him spat on the dirt. "You're losing your nerve, Sheriff. He's just one man." "We've got 7 guns." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He knew numbers didn't matter out here. In this kind of land, the Apache wasn't one man. He was the desert itself. They pressed forward anyway. Torches flickering against the stone. Shadows stretched long, and the canyon walls closed in tight. Every sound, every hoofbeat, every whisper of wind felt like a warning. Somewhere above, unseen, the Apache waited. The woman watched him from their hiding place. He crouched near the ridge, bow drawn, his eyes focused. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. He didn't move. "I do." The words were final. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled around the arrow, ready to release. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of men below. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. The first arrow struck true. It hit the lead rider's hat, snapping the brim clean off. The horse reared, throwing the man into the dust. Panic erupted. Gunfire cracked, echoing through the canyon, but the shots hit only stone. The Apache moved swiftly, disappearing behind one rock and reappearing at another. The posse fired wildly, shouting curses into the emptiness. The sheriff tried to regain control, yelling for them to hold fire, but it was too late. Fear had taken hold. The Apache loosed another arrow, this time cutting through the strap of a man's rifle. It clattered to the ground as the man stumbled backward, his face pale. "He's everywhere," someone shouted. The sheriff's heart pounded as he scanned the cliffs. He caught only glimpses of shadow here, a movement there, but never the man himself. The desert had swallowed him whole. The woman watched it unfold, her chest tight. Every time the bowstring sang, she flinched, torn between relief and dread. She knew he was holding back, aiming to scare, not kill. But she also knew that couldn't last. Once one of those men fired, true. There would be no turning back. The sheriff took cover behind a rock, his voice rising above the chaos. "Stop shooting, damn it! He wants you to waste your bullets." The gunfire slowed, but the fear didn't fade. The oldest trader gritted his teeth and raised his rifle, aiming high toward the ridge. "He ain't no ghost," he muttered. "I'll show you." He fired. The bullet struck the stone near the Apache, shattering rock fragments across his arm. The warrior hissed under his breath, blood seeping down his sleeve. The woman gasped, starting to move toward him, but he held up a hand, motioning for her to stay back. His face was calm again, but his eyes burned like coals. He notched another arrow and waited. The man below reloaded, laughing, thinking he'd driven the ghost away. But as the wind shifted again, the laughter stopped. The Apache stepped into the open for just a moment, framed against the sunset. The trader froze, staring up at him. For that 1 second, time stopped. The warrior raised his bow, and then a shout echoed from behind the posse, another group of riders approaching fast. The sheriff turned, confusion flashing across his face. "Who's that?" But he already knew. The townsfolk had followed, drawn by greed or curiosity. Bringing more guns into the storm, the Apache's arrow stayed poised, his heart steady. The woman clutched the rock beside her, her knuckles white. The canyon was no longer quiet. It was alive with fear, dust, and the coming clash of two worlds. The sheriff tried one last time to shout above the noise, "Hold your fire." But the words were lost in the chaos. The air filled with the sound of hooves, shouts, and gunfire rising again. From his perch above, the Apache exhaled slowly, his mind clear. The moment he had dreaded was here. There would be no peace left to chase after this. He turned once toward the woman, their eyes meeting through the haze. She could see it written on his face, the weight of everything he was about to do, everything it would cost. Below, the posse spread out, rifles raised. The sheriff's voice was lost in the storm. The warrior drew his bowstring back to its limit, the arrow aimed with deadly precision. The wind stilled. The sun sank low. The desert waited, and just as the first shot rang out, the world held its breath. The first gunshot split the air, followed by a storm of sound that swallowed the canyon whole. Dust rose in thick waves, horses screamed, and echoes bounced off the stone walls like thunder. The Apache warrior moved like wind between the rocks, his bow flashing, his arrows slicing through the chaos. He wasn't fighting for revenge now, not fully. He was fighting to end what had already gone too far. To make sure the woman would never again live as a shadow of someone else's cruelty. The sheriff tried to call for order, but no one listened. Fear had taken control. The men fired wildly into the cliffs, into the sky, to their own nightmares. Through the smoke and confusion, the woman saw him standing tall near the edge of the ridge. Her heart pounded, torn between pride and terror. She wanted to scream for him to run, to leave this cursed fight behind, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of rifles. A bullet struck the rock beside him. Another grazed his shoulder, but he didn't fall. He drew his bow once more and aimed not at the men, but at the torch hanging from a rider's saddle. The arrow hit, the flame burst, and the torch fell into the dry brush below. In seconds, fire licked up the canyon walls. The blaze spread fast, crackling through the brittle grass and brush. Smoke filled the air, thick and blinding. Horses reared and bolted, men shouting as the fire turned against them. The sheriff grabbed one of the traders by the arm and pulled him toward safety. "Move. You'll burn alive if you stay." The man jerked free, still trying to reload, still too proud to retreat. But the flames didn't care for pride. The wind changed, pushing the fire back toward them, forcing everyone into the open. High above, the Apache helped the woman climb down the rocky slope. The heat burned their faces, but they didn't stop. Behind them, the sky glowed orange. Below, the remaining riders fled in panic, their cries swallowed by the crackling fire. When they reached the base of the canyon, she stumbled and fell, coughing from the smoke. He lifted her to her feet, his hands steady despite the blood running down his arm. "We keep moving," he said. She looked back one last time, watching the flames consume everything that had brought them pain. It was as if the desert itself was reclaiming justice. By the time the fire began to die, only the sheriff and a few others remained. The traders were gone, either by the flames or their own foolishness. The sheriff stood at the edge of the ashes, his hat in his hand. He had seen war before, but nothing like this one man against many, yet somehow standing taller than them all. He turned toward the trail leading north and side. "You earned your peace, warrior," he muttered. "But it came at a cost none of us will forget." Far from the smoke, the Apache and the woman reached the high plains, where the air was cooler and the sky stretched endless and blue. They stopped by a small stream to rest. The woman knelt beside it, washing soot and tears from her face. "It's over," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. "They won't come again." He looked at the horizon, his jaw tight. "They'll come again," he said. "Different faces, same hearts." She stared at him for a long moment, realizing the truth in his words. The fight between mercy and greed would never end, but for now, they had survived it. That was enough. As night fell, the stars returned, sharp and bright against the dark sky. They made camp near an old cottonwood tree, its leaves whispering softly in the wind. The woman sat close to the fire, her voice gentle. "You could have killed them all," she said, "but you didn't." Poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "Killing them would have changed nothing," he said. "Their deaths don't bring peace. Only truth does." She looked into the flames, thinking about all that had been lost: her family, her freedom, the years that could never be returned. Yet sitting there beside him, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "What now?" she asked. "Where will you go?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the north, where the mountains loomed faintly under the moonlight. "Home," he said finally, "or what's left of it." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. "And if there's nothing left?" He looked at her then, his eyes soft for the first time. "Then I'll build something new." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet strength that made her believe him. The next morning, they rode together across the open plains. The land stretched wide and silent, golden under the rising sun. The wind carried the scent of sage and the soft rustle of grass. Every mile they traveled took them farther from the world that had broken them and closer to one that might heal them. Still, the woman couldn't help but look back once. In the distance, smoke still rose faintly from the canyon, twisting upward like a memory that refused to fade. When they reached the old riverbed, they stopped to rest the horse. The Apache dismounted and walked to the edge of the water, his reflection wavering in the current. The woman joined him, touching his arm. "You saved me," she said softly. "But why? After everything, why risk your life for me?" He turned his head slightly, his voice low. "Because when they took you, they took more than one life. They took what was right, what was sacred. I couldn't let them keep it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She had spent so long feeling like a burden, a ghost of what the world had left behind. But now, standing beside him, she felt seen again, not as a victim, but as a soul still worth saving. "You gave me back my name," she whispered, "and you gave me back my strength." He nodded once. "Then keep them. The world will try to take them again. Don't let it." They traveled on until the mountains grew near. In a quiet valley surrounded by pine, they found the remains of an old Apache village. Time had taken most of it: burned homes, broken pots, the ashes of a life once full. The woman knelt beside a stone circle where the fire pit still stood, her fingers brushing the blackened earth. "This was your home," she said. He nodded, his face unreadable. "What's left of it?" he said. "But it's enough." He gathered stones and began rebuilding the fire ring. She helped him, her hands steady despite the ache in her arms. When the fire finally burned again, its light danced across the ruins, soft and golden. It wasn't a victory, not in the way most men counted victories, but it was a beginning. For days, they stayed there, living quietly, hunting, mending, letting the silence heal what words could not. Sometimes they spoke of the past, sometimes of the future, but mostly they let the stillness speak for them. The desert beyond the valley still burned in places, a reminder of what had been done and what it had cost. Yet in the heart of that silence, something new had been born, something like peace. When the time came for the woman to leave, she stood by the fire, watching him as he tightened the strap of his bow. "You'll stay here?" she asked. He nodded. "For a while. The land needs to breathe again." She smiled sadly. "And if I ever come back?" He looked at her, his eyes calm. "Then I'll be here." She mounted the horse he had given her, the same one that had carried them through the fire. For a moment she hesitated, looking at him one last time. "They'll tell stories about you," she said softly. "About what you did?" He looked toward the horizon. "Let them tell what they want. The truth lives here." He touched his chest, over his heart. She rode away as the morning sun rose over the peaks. The light fell across the valley, turning the ashes to gold. The Apache watched until she disappeared into the distance, then turned back to the fire. The smoke rose into the clear blue sky, thin and graceful, carrying the past away with it. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind moving through the pines, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe without pain. The land was scarred, but it was still alive. So was he. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the woman would tell her story not of loss, but of survival, of forgiveness, of the man who made cruel men beg for it. The desert would remember his name, carried in whispers by the wind, long after the rest of the world forgot.